I'm in this large second-hand Christian bookshop in the southeast of London. I'm looking up and down the shelves, and I turn to my left, and that's where I find this book. You've heard of C.S. Lewis, right? Author of children's books, Chronicles of Narnia, or perhaps you know him for his apologetics works, books like Mere Christianity. I'm a big fan of C.S. Lewis. He's one of my favourite authors. So when I find out that he's written an essay on church music, you can imagine how I feel. I want to show you that essay, see how it might affect our thinking. But also there's another essay that he's written. I think that's changed my mind even more about these kind of things. Let's take a look. First up, Lewis's essay on church music. Now Lewis is a humble guy, and he knows he's way out of his depth when he's talking about church music. So what does he do? He starts simply. He talks about glorifying and edifying. He says when we sing at church, we aim to glorify God, but we also aim to edify the church. And Lewis makes the point, when you're edifying the church, you are in fact also glorifying God. But he also says you can glorify God without edifying the church. And he references 1 Corinthians 14. Perhaps he's thinking of 1 Corinthians 14:17, which says, "You are giving thanks well enough, but no one else is edified." So that's where Lewis starts. But then he goes on to talk about a disagreement. I think it's encouraging that this essay was written, 70 years ago, and there were still disagreements about church music way back then, as there are now. In Lewis's day, the disagreement he describes is between what he calls highbrow and lowbrow music. He describes highbrow music as quality music, high quality music, performed from the front, and everyone in the pews listening. And he describes lowbrow music as people in the pews shouting their favourite hymns, perhaps not as high quality. Lewis is honest. He says he'd probably prefer the highbrow music in that sense. I'd disagree with him, I reckon. But here comes the gold. Listen to what he says next. "The problem is never a merely musical one. Where both the choir and the congregation are spiritually on the right road, no insurmountable difficulties will occur. Discrepancies of taste and capacity will, indeed, provide matter for mutual charity and humility." That last sentence is gold, isn't it? Discrepancies of taste and capacity will indeed provide matter for mutual charity and humility. When I'm faced with music which might not be to my taste, what do? Well, Lewis says that's the perfect opportunity to show humility and show some love to my brothers and sisters around me. I think that's huge. Imagine if all our attitudes changed in that way, if we lovingly put others before ourselves. The problem is never merely a musical one. However, I think another essay that Lewis has written has something even more profound to say about the songs that we sing in church. In this essay called The Language of Religion, Lewis writes about how we talk about God. But before he talks about God, he gives some different examples of language in general. He starts like this. "I begin with 3 sentences. 1. It was very cold. 2. There were 13 degrees of frost. 3. Ah, bitter chill it was. The owl for all his feathers was a cold. The hare limped trembling through the frozen grass, and silent was the flock in woolly fold, numbed were the beadsman's fingers." Lewis goes on to give each of these types of language a name. So the first one he calls ordinary language, the second one scientific language, and the third one poetic language. And he says our language can lie on a scale. It's not discrete categories, but our language can be in between those categories. And here's the thing, I think we tend to think as we get closer to scientific language, we're actually getting closer to the truth. But Lewis explains, actually, both scientific language and poetic language are improvements on ordinary language. They might be improvements in different directions, but they're improvements nonetheless. Scientific language might help us describe the quantity of something, whereas poetic language is an improvement by describing the quality of something. Interestingly, you see both of these types of language in C.S. Lewis's writing. So on the one hand, you've got his scientific apologetic writing, and on the other hand, you've got his fiction, his stories, his poetic writing. You've got reason and you've got imagination. Perhaps you see this contrast in the Bible as well. Perhaps you've got Paul's letters on one hand and the poetry of the Psalms on the other hand. When it comes to the words that we use to describe God, all our language is analogical. Whether it's scientific or poetic language, that can help us talk about God more accurately. Now, all that is to say, don't despise poetry or don't fear songs. Like I said earlier, I think we tend to think the closer we get to scientific language, the more accurate we are. But Lewis helps us to see actually poetic language can be really helpful. It can help us understand the quality of God. So don't be afraid of songs, don't be afraid of poetic language. Poetry isn't just flowery and getting further away from the truth. No, it can really help us. Perhaps that's why God puts it in his word, the Bible, to help us understand who he is. If you're thinking of writing a song, let me leave you with this advice from C.S. Lewis that he wrote in a letter to someone. Don't use adjectives which merely tell us how you want us to feel about the things you are describing. I mean, instead of telling us the thing is terrible, describe it so that we'll be terrified. Don't say it was delightful. Make us say delightful when we've read the description. So there you have it, 2 essays from C.S. Lewis, which I think have changed my mind on how I think about church music.